When you're shy or just bored, it's safer to be on your screen, and in that world it's an acceptable thing to do rather than just sitting there.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman and you're listening to No Filter, candid conversations that count. Sex, drugs and rock and roll. That's what we used to worry about when it came to the things that would mess up kids. Also smoking, pregnancy, alcohol, and those stupid things in your ears that stretch your earlobes and help you not get a job. Here's some good news you might not know about. The rate of all those old school bad things like teen pregnancy and smoking and drinking and drugs have fallen off a cliff. The bad news though? We seem to have accidentally replaced them with something far more insidious and potentially addictive. Phones, screens, social media and video games. They're changing the minds and the behaviour of a generation, and anxiety and depression among young people has exploded over the same period. Coincidence? And it's not just kids that it's happening to. When this topic was first proposed to me for a No Filter interview, I scrunched up my face like you do when you smell something bad. I don't want to be lectured or frightened or made more anxious about life than I already am, because I'm already really, really anxious. But when I heard that David Gillespie had written a new book called Teen Brain, Why Screens Are Making Your Teenager Depressed, Anxious and Prone to Lifelong Addictive Illnesses and How to Stop It Now, I remembered how much I loved talking to him about his last book, which was about psychopaths and how to identify toxic people in your life. David has a way of making kind of scary, potentially dry topics absolutely come to life. So I read the book and I had so many aha moments all the way through. It helped me to articulate so many of the feelings that I already had about the effect of screen addiction, and it also made sense of so many things that I hadn't even realised, things that hadn't occurred to me. So I was super keen to have David on the show and ask him all of my very many questions about what the hell is going on and how can we fix it. Here's David Gillespie. You say that you decided to write this book a long time ago and you had children for the very purpose of writing this book.
Yeah, that's probably a little bit of creative license, I'd say. I didn't. But I guess having a lot of kids who have been teenagers over the last decade, and our kids span in age from 23 down to 15 now. So the 23-year-old is right at the leading edge of Gen Z. That's probably about the oldest you'll get a Gen Z, and the 15-year-olds are right in the middle of it. So I've sort of been seeing it in action. The things that I talk about in the book are things that I have been seeing and living every day. So whilst I obviously didn't intend to have children to write a book about them, turns out that's what happened.
I want to talk about that generation, how they're different. Some of the people listening to this might know people of that generation. They might be part of that generation. They might have kids that fall into that generation or will at some stage. Tell me how this generation is fundamentally different to those who've come before it.
Biochemically, they're fundamentally exactly the same, which is kind of the problem because they're in an environment that no human has ever experienced before. And by that I mean every single one of these kids is now exposed 24/7 to highly potentially addictive behaviours, software and other things that can really mess with the particularly fragile state of the adolescent brain. Now, that fragile state has always existed. So they're not different in that way. What's different is the environment that surrounds them.
I want to step through some of the things you talk about, some of the things that are different. And before we talk about environmentally what's different for them, I want to understand a few terms that you reference through the book. You talk about danger porn and approval porn.
Yes.
And how boys are more susceptible to danger porn and girls are more susceptible to approval porn. So let's just talk about what they are first of all and why they're so attractive.
Yeah, so they're completely made-up terms, made up by me, and only because they seem to fit what the definition ended up being. We all know what real porn is, so sex porn. It's a highly addictive simulation of sex. Now, sex itself is addictive because we have a wiring, a reward system in our brain to ensure we do it. And if we didn't have that, there wouldn't be too many generations of humans. And similarly, we have a reward system wired to make sure we eat for exactly the same reasons. That reward system can be perverted by simulation. So,
explain that.
Well, most people don't get to have sex all the time. Most people don't get to have it as much as they would like to have it. Most people don't get to eat as much as they would like to eat. And so, as a general rule, our reward system never gets maxed out. We never get so much reward that it creates what I would call an addiction cycle, where reward feeds reward feeds reward feeds reward. So it never turns into an addiction. It's just merely rewarding.
You talk about in the book, you give some examples, which I'd love you to explain, of experiments that have been done on humans around addiction and dopamine. Can you explain that?
So what happens in our reward system is that we're given a squirt of dopamine when we encounter something rewarding or when there's the potential for something rewarding, and that motivates us to get off our bottoms and chase the thing. When we get the thing, it gets dialed down by something called GABA, which is our braking system that says, great, got your reward, dial it back down now.
I've had my sex.
Yep.
I've had my
Enjoy
meal.
This. Yeah. Now have the enjoyable bit, which is a flood of serotonin. GABA dials down the dopamine. Dopamine puts us on edge. It makes us ready to accept a reward. It makes us chase rewards. So some of these
So it's got to be motivating in it.
Yeah. So, for
action.
example, some of the animal experiments they've done with dopamine is that they'll disable the dopamine centers in the animal's brain. The animal was perfectly normal beforehand, but then they're disabled. The animal will eat if food is placed in its mouth, but it won't move to get it.
Because it can't be bothered.
It can't be bothered. It doesn't have the motivating effect of dopamine. So dopamine is partially pleasurable, partially puts us on edge, sharpens us up mentally, sharpens our muscles up, makes us chase rewards. When we get the reward, GABA kicks in, shuts it down, and gives us a nice flood of serotonin.
So is that the feeling of fullness after a meal?
It's part of that.
Happiness
it's also
after
just happiness.
sex.
Yeah, just euphoria. You've achieved the thing that you were chasing. And the value of that thing depends on the size of that reward you get. Now, that's when it's all working well. Now, what you can do is artificially pervert that system, and that's the experiments you were talking about before. There have been some questionable experiments ethically done in humans where they have directly perverted that system. So they've given a human the ability to dial up their own dopamine. So implanted electrodes in their brain, give them an electronic dial that allows them to dial it up. And so they do. They dial it up. And it feels great. And they dial it up again, and it feels great again. So they're hitting the dopamine switch every time. The dopamine's putting them on edge, making them anticipate reward. They never get the reward, though. It just keeps getting them in that state of anticipation, ready to go, ready to go, ready to go. And even though they know it's not giving them a reward, they keep pressing the button. And that replicates experiments that were done in animals that will do exactly the same thing with a lever. The humans were doing it hundreds of times an hour until they removed them from them. There was one woman in one experiment was doing it so often she formed calluses on the fingers that were dialing the button.
So it's not necessarily a sexual pleasure that they get out of it. It's more just like a euphoric feeling.
Yeah, it's anticipation of reward. So they're hitting that button and they feel that way you feel when you anticipate a reward. Okay. When you anticipate sex or a good meal or whatever, that's a good feeling.
Yeah.
It puts you right on edge, but then they don't get the reward. Now, porn, sexual porn, does exactly the same thing for sex, which is it doesn't always result in the same outcome as sex. It does the stimulation bit, like dialing the dopamine button in experiments, but it doesn't always produce the result. So in that way, it's an artificial stimulant in exactly the same way that a dopamine button is. Now, coming back to your original question about approval porn and danger porn. Now, approval porn works exactly the same way on a system that is dominant in females because females are more respondent to something called oxytocin, which is we'll probably come to speak to a little bit more about, but it's essentially a hormone that rewards us with feelings of social acceptance. And that, up until now, the only real way to get that is to get social acceptance. So behave the way the group wants you to behave, have them think nice things about you, get the oxytocin reward, all good. Finally, humans have invented a simulation of that, and it's called social media. And the way that simulation works is that you get to keep score. You get to see how many likes your photo gets, how much approval you're receiving.
So social media is like the gamification of social approval.
Social interaction, social approval.
Can you explain in the real world what that social approval might be? Like how before the internet did we get social approval, and how do we still, that's not screen related?
Yeah, so by working together in groups. This is a hormone that is particularly effective in females, which makes them work together.
Because we had to gather while the men were out hunting.
That's right.
We were gathering.
And look after the
children.
Critically, look after the children.
Yes, looking after the children.
Because they're the next generation. The men are actually disposable because their job is done as far as the next generation is concerned.
As long as they've made the next generation.
That's
but
right.
they've got to bring us some meat.
They do, but the community would survive without it. It's kind of a bonus. So there's hard wiring there that says work together.
For women particularly.
Well, women are more responsive to the signals from oxytocin. Doesn't mean men aren't. It just means women are more responsive to it. And that work together gives you oxytocin rewards. So if you do things that the group approves of, you feel better. They like you, you feel them liking you, you get a reward. So that's how it works. It also has another edge to it, which is it also creates in-groups and out-groups. So you feel that way about your in-group, and everyone who's not in your in-group is the enemy. So oxytocin makes you aggressive towards people who are not part of your in-group and highly supportive of people who are part of your in-group. So in real life, that's how it works. And it works for a very specific purpose, which is preservation of the species for the next generation. Approval porn takes exactly that scenario and allows you to do it to the world, to people you don't know, and still get exactly the same feedback about liking you. So when you understand that, it explains a lot of the things about what motivates people. So,
and it also explains, and we're going to jump around, but it also explains why our daughters are more interested in social media than our sons, or why women are and men tend to, if they're on social media, they might look, but they'll lurk. Like my husband and my son will never post on Facebook and never like. You'll never know they're there. They might look at it or on Instagram, but you'll never know that they're there. Whereas women are liking and posting, and because we're more susceptible to oxytocin.
Women are farming the likes because it has a direct impact on their feeling of self-worth.
What do you mean by farming the likes?
So that means putting stuff up that allows people to tell you they like you. So
that's exactly what it is.
So it's putting it out there and allowing people to express how much they like you. Now, oxytocin, by the way, you don't have to use the internet to do it. You can pat a dog and you'll get a shot of oxytocin for you and the dog, by the way. So it's a community binding glue. It's a way of making us
or
stick
sniffing
together.
a baby.
That's right. In fact, it's a very important part of what binds a mother to their baby. It's a feedback loop that says it provides pleasure, it gives good feelings to the person receiving it. And all that's happened is, as you said, it's been gamified with social media, whereas they've figured out a way to make us do that without actual human interaction.
You talk in the book, and we'll get to danger porn in a minute, but you talk in the book about how real-world risks for teenagers have dropped.
Yes.
You write, Generation Z aren't like any generation that's gone before them. They simultaneously know everything and nothing. They are the first generation to have experienced 24/7 access to portable digital devices. As a result, the rates of addictive behaviour that requires them to be physically present, such as drugs, smoking, drinking, sex and physical danger, have declined massively. But electronic simulations of those things have skyrocketed, and along with them, rates of anxiety and depression.
Yep. So if you look at the statistics, it's really quite extraordinary. We've gone from, in 2007, so prior to the release of the first iPhone, which might seem like centuries ago when you say, because no one can imagine a life without iPhones, but believe it or not, in 2007 they didn't exist. And if we look at the stats then, people were very worried about a series of addictive behaviours in the real world that were growing. So teen pregnancy, alcohol abuse. Cigarettes was the only one dropping, but only because of sustained efforts in various countries to try and move people away from them. But even then, it was a battle. All of that stuff was going the way it had always gone, which is up. And then in 2007, all of those stats turned the other direction. Slowly at first, and then in 2010 they get a real kick along when the iPad is released. And I'm not targeting Apple here.
Yeah, it's just technology.
The other makers were following along just as hard and just as fast. All those stats turned down. So now if we look at stats like compare 2007 to 2017 on teen pregnancy, half the rate of teen pregnancy. You can say the same thing about alcohol consumption. You can say the same thing about violence involving teens. You can say the same thing about violent crime involving teens. So it's been an incredible turnaround. We've seen nothing like it ever before, and I am amazed it doesn't make the news more often because.
Well, it's good news. Why would it?
It's very good news. We've been fighting these things for decades, and then suddenly they've all gone off a cliff, and nobody's asking why. What happened in 2010 that suddenly made all these things vanish? And the answer, I believe, is they found something better to do, which is they found a way to access all of the feelings they could feel with those things in real life, but they could do it from the safety of their own bedroom.
Let's talk about danger porn because that's one of the things, boys and adolescent boys, and you talk about the fact that the adolescent brain is not fully formed until age 25.
Yep.
So boys have always been programmed to want to take risks.
Yeah, by something called testosterone. When you compare levels of testosterone in teenage boys to teenage girls, they're not even on the same planet. Teenage boys have it coming out their ears. It is massive levels. Even compared to adult males, it's massive. Now, testosterone does a couple of things. It makes them bigger, more physically capable, stronger, and so on. It also completely removes their impulse control. Now, teenagers, as we may speak about, don't have a lot of impulse control to start with, and boys have it completely removed. The testosterone drives them to take risks and to have, in terms of a risk assessment, almost no ability to judge any downside. And that's something you really have to bear in mind about the way they behave. This is, of course, why women bothered inventing males in the first place. If you need to have a variant of your species which is A, disposable, B, aggressive, C, prepared to take physical risks, then that's the way to do it. Send them out to kill the woolly mammoths or whatever. If you lose a few, too bad, as long as they've produced the next generation. Now, that's probably a very simplistic way of putting it, but ultimately that's what's gone on. The true humans are female. We all start out as female. The Y chromosome carriers get a shot of testosterone that turns them into males. And they have, from an evolutionary perspective, a very definite use, which is to do the dangerous stuff. Now, what that means in terms of in a generation where no one's killing woolly mammoths is that they have a brain that's wired to do it, to take risks, to experience danger, and in a certain way to enjoy it. Now, people might say, well, how do you enjoy danger? You don't enjoy the danger bit, but you do enjoy the relief of surviving it.
That's what you get addicted to.
That's what you get addicted to, is the relief of surviving danger.
So does the dopamine, in the case of teenage boys and with people with more testosterone, does it drive them to take the risks?
No, the testosterone drives them to take the risks, but the dopamine makes it form part of their reward pathway so that it motivates them to try again. And every time they don't kill themselves is a success in that they relief, they survived, etc. Now, once again, that's been gamified, but this time by real games, which is, and this is what boys prefer to do online. And as you were talking about before, it's not that boys don't use social media, they just use it differently. And it's not that girls don't play online games, they do, but they play a different type of online game. Boys like to play games like Fortnite, which involve high levels of aggression, and killing lots of people. And you've got to remember that the aim of Fortnite is to kill 99 people. To win Fortnite, you have to kill the other 99 people you're playing with. So it's designed to simulate an aggression fueled environment with lots of risk, and that's exactly what it does do. And it's the culmination of probably 10 years of development in the gaming industry to create realistic first-person shooters that accurately simulate danger, and that's what boys like, and that's why I call that danger porn.
That makes so much sense, because what I've noticed, my eldest son is 21, and I've got a lot of friends with kids, sons who are teenagers and older, and we all notice that around age 15, 16, around year 10 for boys, they become really unsettled, and it's almost like in a different era, they would be going to war, or they would be getting married, or they would be going to work, something. And I guess it's that surge of testosterone that's driving them to seek some kind of danger. So I joked about how I'd write a parenting book called No Ice, No ISIS, because it's no accident that ISIS tends to recruit young boys around that adolescent age, because they're looking for that.
Yeah.
They're attracted to danger.
Yes. Yeah, they are. And the interesting thing is even if you look at stats on, say, things like violent crime and even physical injury, so they're almost identical. A teenage boy is 3 times as likely to be involved in violent crime as a teenage girl. A teenage boy is 3 times likely to die as a result of physical injury as a teenage girl. And now, whilst all these stats have been dropping, those ratios have still been staying in place. Boys take more risks. And all that's happened with the gaming industry is that they've taken the edge off that. So that was something that was going up and up and up and up in real life, and now they're doing it online, and so those stats are dropping. But they are still 3 times as likely to injure themselves, 3 times as likely to injure others.
Because they don't really know how to manage risk.
No.
In the real world.
Well, no, and that's by definition an adolescent. An adolescent has an impaired risk management system, and that's because of a very particular thing that's going on in that phase of brain development that impairs their ability to do that. Layer in testosterone for boys and oxytocin for girls, and you really make it that they can't manage risk. So
we know that the gambling industry is very, very good at addicting people. But we often think that social media and gaming, gaming is a sport now, and isn't it great that they can play with their friends and be at home and they're not out doing anything dangerous and they're under our roof, or they're in their bedroom on Facebook or Instagram. Are the tech companies working deliberately to addict our kids?
Of course they are. There's hundreds of millions of apps competing for that little 7 square inches of screen space in front of your child's eyes. The hundreds of millions of companies who will rise and fall on their ability to keep your child engaged. And anyone who believes that isn't purposefully addictive is delusional. Of course it is. They have to make sure they are the one app that wins. They are the one
that wins your time.
That wins your time. That gets you clicking back again and again and again. And hundreds of millions of apps fail every day because they can't break through that. The ones that succeed are the ones that have cracked the code and hooked up to our addiction system and our reward system and made us keep coming back. You could do Facebook, for example, or Instagram without likes. You could do them. The functionality would be almost identical.
Yeah.
No one would use them. Because the thing driving their use is the ability to give feedback about you.
So they know that once they've got our time and our attention, they can then monetize that.
Absolutely.
What are the different ways that social media and gaming monetize our time and our eyes?
There's that old saying, which is, if a product's free, you're the product. And that's what's going on here.
And then, of course, the games.
Yeah.
As I may or may not know from first-hand experience, if you're not vigilant, your child can spend a shit ton of your money on.
That's right.
What do they spend it on, David?
So creating money out of this isn't just ads.
Because there's not ads on, ads on gaming.
There's no ads on Fortnite. Where they make the money on Fortnite is in stuff that doesn't matter, but which makes them look cool. So it's on costumes and it's on dances. So in Fortnite, for example, and I'm just using this as an example, there are many games in this category.
Skins, they're called.
Yeah, this is just the most obvious one. I mean, they're printing money, hundreds of millions of dollars a month, out of selling nothing in particular. Digital vaporware, if you want. It's skins, new dances.
And it can be very hard to explain that to a kid who just had to press a button about, no, that was real money and it came out of my account and it went to Fortnite and what have you got to show for it?
And it's not much anyway to them. It's $8 or something, I think, is a skin. So they think, well, this is, I'm not spending $80 or $800 here. I'm spending $8.
Some of them are. Some of them can buy. Also, there are packs you can buy, David, for $120 and $175.
And they all have versions of that. The thing that's unique about Fortnite is most other games that sell stuff in game, it actually improves your performance. So you can buy better tanks, guns, ships, whatever it is. But in Fortnite, you can't. You can't improve your performance by buying stuff. You can just look cooler. And so it's amazing, given that that's all they are buying, the amount of money they make from it.
When we look at the combined effect of approval porn and danger porn for adolescents, so we're talking, what's the average age that kids get a phone or access to screens?
Oh, the data on that is pretty skinny, and I think probably wrong. One of the big problems here is that it's moving so fast. Remember, you could go back to 2010 and not find a school in Australia that had a one-to-one computer program. Almost no children. My eldest bought one of the first iPads that came into Australia in early 2011. So that is just 8 years ago. Research doesn't move that fast. Nobody's got accurate data on this stuff.
And I think the other reason it's hard to measure is that, you can have strict rules about when your kid gets a phone, but they're going to have unfettered access to a screen, whether it's mum's phone, the iPad that's in the family area, the laptop, whatever it happens to be.
The problem here is not so much the screen, it's the portability. I had access to screens when I was in high school, and that was many, many years ago. That was in the 80s, and there were screens.
We played Pong.
It was an Apple IIe. You played Pong or you played artillery or something. It did it all on a green screen. But critically, it was in the middle of the living room. No one was taking an Apple IIe to their bedroom and looking at it under the covers, even if there was anything worth looking at anyway. The critical thing here is partly the software, which is, as I said, designed to addict, engineered minute by minute to addict, but partly the fact that these things are extremely portable. So they can be on their person all their time, and so they are.
At one school that I know of, they've got a real problem with the girls going into the bathroom and watching Netflix at recess and lunch. And that's hard to police. It's really hard to police.
Not only is it hard to police, there's a hidden impact on our education system too, which is almost every school now has invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in providing Wi-Fi capabilities and high-speed access to the internet to allow every kid to be able to access that. The hidden cost in all of this is not just the devices and the effect they're having on their kids, which we'll talk about in a sec, but there's also a real monetary cost. They aren't getting any more money, these schools. They're somehow absorbing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of infrastructure and constant upgrades into their educational budgets.
What effect is it having on the social connections that kids and people should be making? The use of screens?
Well, you've only got so much time. So if you're spending your time on a screen, and the reason you might prefer to spend your time on a screen for social acceptance than in person is in person takes more effort. In person, you run, I guess, an approach risk in the sense that if you walk up to a group of people who obviously know each other, you could be rejected right there and then. You don't face that possibility if you post something on Instagram. Sure, you might not get as many likes as you want, but it's not rejection. So there's a combination of not having enough time to interact socially and it being easier to just do it on a screen.
It's not just at schools either. I mean, I sort of became aware recently that I've got 3 kids and my youngest doesn't have a phone, but everybody else does. And in the morning, we're all sitting in the family area before we go to work and before we go to school, and we're all looking at our screens, except the youngest one who doesn't have one. So he's kind of wanting to talk, and everyone else is looking at their calendar, looking at the weather, catching up on the headlines, doing legitimate things. And once upon a time, that would have been looking at the newspaper. But the normal social interactions that would have happened a generation ago, not even a generation ago, 10, 15 years ago, aren't happening anymore.
Well, you can see, just walk into any restaurant. People sitting across from each other, both on their screens.
And school playgrounds as well.
That's right. And that's because it's a safe thing to do. When you're shy or just bored, it's safer to be on your screen, and in that world, it's an acceptable thing to do rather than just sitting there looking lonely.
And people talk about resilience a lot. My feeling is that that's part of why we're losing our resilience. I mean, resilience is a muscle. If you don't keep using it, it gets floppy and it diminishes. But the uncomfortable moments of social interaction, we're stripping them away so that no one has to feel any kind of discomfort.
Well, like any skill, social interaction is a skill. It's something you have to practice. Yeah. You don't become the shooter for the diamonds without practicing putting balls through a hoop. Same goes for social interaction. If the first time you bother interacting with real people is when you're 19 years old, it's not going to go as well as if you'd been doing it for the last 9 years. So there's a lot of practice involved in how to react, how to behave, all that sort of thing. And the less practice you get, the less good you'll be at it.
Okay, so we've outlined the problem pretty well. I was going to say, what does addiction in teenagers or adults look like? What does addiction look like?
People get all panicky about the definition of addiction. I think it's wrong to say the only kind of addiction that exists in the world is addiction to cocaine or heroin or something like that. That is patently nonsense. There is absolutely no doubt that addiction is a perversion of our reward system. It's taking something that is, by any definition, low-level addiction on purpose. We are addicted to sex because it propagates the species. End of story. So that is an addiction mechanism, but it takes that and it perverts it. And how it perverts it is by hitting that dopamine button far too frequently. We have an adjustment in our brain, an epigenetic adjustment called delta phos-B, which is kind of like a ratchet. Every time we hit a dopamine button, it ratchets up one, and then it decays. So give it a break between when you hit it again, and it'll decay back down to a normal level. Hit it over and over and over and over and over, and that thing is ratcheting right up. And that means that delta phos-B tells us our tolerance for dopamine, how much we have to get to feel good. So if you hit that thing over again, over and over, this is why social interaction is desirable but not addictive in real life. But the ability to simulate it and repeatedly hit it fast pushes that ratchet up and up and up and up. And then you've turned something that's desirable into something that's addictive.
Because your baseline's gone up.
That's right. And if you pull back from the addiction, and this is what withdrawal is with all addictions, you give that thing time to reset. It will reset entirely within 3 months. But the fact that I said 3 months and not 3 minutes there tells you how slow this is.
Oh, God, David, 3 months. I may as well have said 300 years.
That's right. But that's what happens.
How do you know if a kid's addicted?
Because they can't put it down. They can't.
Well, that's all of us, isn't it?
It is all of us. But it's...
I notice your phone's not here on the desk while we're talking.
Have it in my pocket. But people who are older generations, weren't wired for this when they were younger, and B, had their brains mature before there was the ability for this. The other thing that happens with addiction is there's something called a gateway effect, which is that ratchet point, the delta phos-B, is the same for all addictions. And it's the same mechanism. So once you are addicted to one thing, you are addicted to everything, or potentially addicted to everything.
Is that why when people give up smoking, they might drink more coffee, or
they put on weight because they eat sugar?
Yeah,
because sugar's addictive. Or they start drinking vast quantities of coffee. So it is...
Because they're looking for that hit somewhere else.
Same hit, same mechanism. And it also makes you much more susceptible, which is why the statistics tell us that a child who starts drinking before the age of 18 is more than twice as likely to have an alcoholism problem once they're an adult. So your risks are much higher when you're a teenager because you're much more susceptible to addiction because you've lost a braking system called the GABA braking system, which we may mention, and that allows you to access addictive behaviours more easily and drive your delta phos-B up more quickly. So once you are in that state where you are addicted to one thing, then you are much more easily addicted to anything.
We were talking, David, about the different ways that the tech companies addict us
Yep.
to technology. A little while ago, at the suggestion of a friend, I turned my phone from colour to black and white to grayscale, and I found the most extraordinary feeling of sadness. For the first day, every time I looked at my phone, I just felt sad. And now I realise that it was almost like an interruption of the dopamine or an interruption of something.
So what makes you feel sad is serotonin. So your serotonin levels were dropping because you weren't finding it as rewarding.
I didn't get that
Yeah.
excitement that
Yeah.
I hadn't realised. I suppose if you'd have told me before, I used to say, I get this feeling when I can see my phone just before I'm about to pick it up.
That's
if I've been
dopamine.
looking dopamine.
Yep.
So then I pick it up and then I get the reward
That's
of
right.
looking at Instagram or looking at whatever it is, looking
It
at my
calms
emails
you
or
and
checking
makes
my
you feel
WhatsApps
good.
because there's stuff happening, right? And I'm socially connecting and I'm doing things and it's exciting. When my phone was black and white, I was much less interested in looking at it. Now,
Interesting.
I adjusted within a week
Yeah.
to the point where I was still looking at it quite a lot, but I was never as excited to see it because it wasn't all those colours and it wasn't as exciting.
Never assume with technology that anything is by chance. I've worked in this industry. I know what goes into design. And these guys spend enormous amounts of money and effort on every single decision. Should that pixel be there? Should it be there? What colour should it be? We're getting feedback from the beta testers that is distracting them.
And the fact notifications are in red so
That's
that it
right.
means
urgent.
urgent.
Every single thing you see on that screen has been engineered to within an inch of its life to have maximum engagement. And that's why I laugh when people tell me that software can't be addictive.
All right, so let's switch gears. What can we do? Is it too late to save ourselves? And if so, how do we save our children?
I guess there's one thing we haven't really covered, which is there's a special susceptibility biochemically in adolescent years. Remember I mentioned before GABA, which GABA is a neurotransmitter that turns off dopamine. So in essence, it stops us becoming
Is it
addicted.
like willpower?
Sort of, but at a biochemical level. It actually turns it off. So it's part of our reward system. When we get the reward, it kicks in and turns off the dopamine so that we don't keep ratcheting up our dopamine set points and become addicted to things. So it's about dialing it all down again. Calm down. We got the reward. Let's move on.
Don't have to keep
Don't
eating.
have to keep eating. Don't
have more
to,
sex.
That's right. So it shuts everything down. And GABA is important as a suppressor. It's a multi-purpose suppressor of stuff. That's, of course, the technical term. And it is important in stopping our reward system becoming an addiction system. And that's
it's how you can have a Tim Tam but not need to eat the whole packet or not become addicted to Tim Tams. You just have a Tim Tam and it's really nice when you have one.
That's right, as long as that's all operating well. Now, the interesting thing about GABA is that in puberty, we dial it down massively.
Why?
Because we can't start puberty without it. It's such a multi-purpose suppressor of stuff. It suppresses our ability to enter puberty. So it's what stops us going into puberty as soon as we're born. And for reasons that are not quite clear in a timing sense, it waits 10 years, probably until all the other bits of the body are ready for it, and then it dials down and puberty starts. It happens on a mini scale, by the way, in women every month, in that the only way for a period to start is with GABA dialing down. So it's
That's why we can't suppress our inner bitch. Or is that just me?
Well, no. It's why, depending on which phase, a woman is either more likely to become addicted or less likely to become addicted than a male, because of the different variants in GABA. So when we dial GABA down, our reward system is much more easily addicted because the brakes are off. GABA stops us. If you take the braking system out, which is what we do when we enter puberty, then when we're exposed to addictive behaviours or substances, we have no way of stopping. And the GABA doesn't kick in. It doesn't help us. It doesn't to stop a reward becoming an addiction. And that's at exactly the moment that we've decided to expose an entire generation to the most addictive software known to man.
Oh my God.
So it's always been there, always.
Yeah.
Adolescence, it actually helps us become adults because it allows us to take risks that an adult would not take. It allows us to learn. It allows us to push the boundaries. But in this particular environment, it actually just opens up the gateway to addiction because it says, you know what, going to take all the control systems off here.
And that's why we've had rules. You can't drink, you can't smoke, you can't gamble, you can't do all these known addictive things
And people
before the age of 18.
And people disobey them, but it's a relatively small subset. Whereas now we're saying to every child, you can have access to addictive everything all the time at a time when your brain has been dialed down to allow you to become addicted. So that's why it's dangerous. GABA, by the way, doesn't recover to adult levels until our early 20s. So during that entire phase, we're sitting there, a sitting duck for addiction, and what we've decided to do is expose that entire generation to addiction.
Before we talk about what we can do, I want to ask you what happens when Gen Z, your son's 23, mine's 21, when they get into the workforce and have to take over the running of the world. What does this potentially mean?
We're already getting a preview of this. So we're starting to see in the United States an opioid addiction which is unbelievable in its effect. As I said before, there's a gateway effect with addiction, which is once you're addicted to one thing, you're addictable to anything. And these people have had access to addictive substances like never before. And they are all primed to access addiction, which is what will be driving. And the opioid wave we're currently seeing is just the pointy thin end of it. It's just those really, the older edge of that generation starting to hit into that. When all of them get access to that stuff, I believe it's nothing less than cataclysmic for our society because we've seen addiction for a long time, since at least the 1960s. By the way, prior to the 1960s, it was very hard to get addicted to much. There wasn't an awful lot you could get addicted to, except perhaps alcohol and cigarettes.
Can you get addicted to like TV? So say, like watching television or a television show. Can you get addicted to that?
Certainly you can. Just watch Netflix. How many people binge watch an entire season of Netflix? The difference between Netflix and television is that you might be fiendishly addicted to the Brady Bunch, but
it's only on once a week at 4 o'clock.
That's right. There's a natural break.
Yeah.
And your delta phos B gets to reset. You might find it the most attractive thing in the world, but you've got to wait a week till you see it again. So normal programmed television, not so much. You might enjoy it. You might keep coming back every week because you remembered you enjoyed it, but it's very hard to become addicted to it.
Can you get addicted to people?
Once again, in real life, we have things that motivate us to behave in certain ways. People that we like to spend time with because we find that rewarding. So addicted in that sense, which is we find it rewarding. Addicted in the sense that this is a problem, no, I don't see how that could happen unless you had some way of being non-stop exposed to the pleasure you receive from
being with that person.
What
are some of the signs that a kid might be addicted?
The big sign is, for most parents, and these just from talking to parents and my own lived experience, is you're constantly finding them with a device when they shouldn't. They know the rules, they know it should be there, they know they shouldn't be accessing it, and yet over and over and over again you find them with the device.
They default back to it all the time.
They default back to it all the time. So it's like the people who had the dopamine electrodes implanted in their brains. They have to keep pressing the button, and it doesn't matter what the potential downside to that is. You catching them, implementing punishment regime, whatever, unless that punishment regime involves physically removing the device, they're going to be back at it as soon as they can be.
What are the rules? Tell us what we've got to do, David.
This is the hard bit. And I've got to say that, I didn't descend from space with a complete rule book all sorted out. I've been learning this on the go. And I got to say, I felt it was overkill. My wife, Lizzie, has been a lot tougher about this than I have in the past until I read the science. Now that I understand what is actually going on in these kids' brains, I'm much more inclined to actually enforce the rules. And the rules are pretty simple. keep these devices visible in a public place in the house at all times. So the rule has got to be it goes on that rack by the television and it stays there. Then you get the inevitable, but I need it for homework. Mm-hmm. Which we could talk about school's role in this as well later, but I need it for homework. Then it has to be, okay, but it's still going to be at that table in a public place where anyone could walk past at any time and see what's on the screen. And that is easy to say and a lot harder to do because you get distracted.
And they also say, what about my privacy? I mean, teenagers, they want to be able to talk to their friends in private without mum and dad or whoever it happens to be looking over their shoulder.
And this is one of our other rules, which is we don't give our high school age kids devices that can access the internet. The school gives them devices, makes them have devices that can access the internet, but we're certainly not going to provide a phone that can access the internet. So they get flip phones. They hate them. Hate them.
So retro.
But they have them because they need some sort of safety mechanism, in this age of deleted public phone booths. But that's it. They don't need anything else. And luckily, they're very, very cheap. Because they undergo extraordinary damage on a very regular basis because they don't care about them. But that's the only way that they get access to the internet other than via a gateway controlled by us or a school.
Yeah, but they're going to get to school and someone's going to show them this or watch this video or they'll be at a friend's house or a sleepover. You're aware of that, right?
Absolutely. And just like with sugar, we control the sugar environment in our home. We can't control what happens when they go to a party or go to a friend's house or go to school, but we're working on harm minimisation, not elimination. It's impossible to say our kids will never, ever see anything dodgy on the internet. That is just never going to happen. Of course they will. They're kids in a generation that is swamped with internet everywhere. But we're trying to minimise the harm.
So no phones that can access the internet.
Yep.
Screens in publicly available places. What else?
Real consequences. I guess that's the thing that we find is most effective is that there be a real consequence for breaking a rule and that it be consistently enforced. As soon as there's any notion that it's negotiable, which I've got to admit I've been guilty of a lot. I'm the soft touch. I'm the one that they can negotiate with. But I've certainly gotten a lot more backbone once I've understood what's actually going on in their brains. But no negotiation on rules, which is if we said you lose access to that device for 24 hours if you are caught with it in your bedroom, then that must be what happens. And so that's what we do. The other thing we do to try and limit device access is on holidays. They're removed, locked up, put away. There is no longer the excuse of I need it for school. And so, therefore, it has no purpose being in their lives. And we get a shakedown every holiday. We get it first few days is all kinds of ugly. But after that, you get your normal kids back.
I've heard that again and again, the idea of that. It's interesting because most people, including me, tend to relax screen time rules during holidays, where it's like it's school holidays, okay, you can watch, you can play your video games, you can spend more time online. Because, YouTube is the other big thing. Forget about watching free-to-air television. That doesn't even exist. They don't know what that is.
No.
It's all about YouTube.
Yes.
What role does that play? I mean, I've been reading in so much lately about the way that pushes kids through to extremism around all kinds of things because they watch one bit of content, then it says, why don't you watch this? Why don't you watch this? Why don't you watch this? I don't just mean like religious or those kinds of extremism, but just extreme content in whatever area.
It just keeps, as I said before, if you're horrifically addicted to the Brady Bunch, you have to wait a week. In YouTube, there's no gap. In fact, you can do nothing and the next video will play. Selected for you by an algorithm designed by software engineers
to
who
keep
want
you
to
there.
Addict you.
Yes.
Allowing a kid to get involved in that conveyor belt is simply handing them over to the people who design those algorithms and saying, see how easy it is, see how much you can market to my kid without a gatekeeper, because they all involve ads too. So that's what's going on there. And I agree with you. A lot of parents, and this was us too, would say they're on holidays, they're bored, they're not supposed to be working anyway, so why can't they? And the answer is because of the biochemistry of what we've seen. Give them a break. Give them a chance for their delta phos-B to recover and get back to normal levels. You will subvert addiction. And people will say, but they get bored. Yes, they do. Absolutely, they get bored. Within seconds, they get bored. And then they find something to do. So, they find something, they rediscover toys they haven't touched in a million years, or they rediscover that they have a backyard, or they rediscover that they have friends. They get bored, but then they find something to do.
When you talk about vigilance and consequences, all of that means that parents have to be around a lot.
Yep.
For some parents, they're at work, they might be a single mum, the kids are in aftercare or they're at home unsupervised, particularly if they're teenagers, they're probably at home unsupervised for a lot of the time. Yep. How do you do that without someone at home full time?
I don't think there's a good answer to that. There are some answers to it. There is software that you can use that limits access. I'm not I'm not at all confident in its capabilities. I'm not at all confident in my capability to properly set it up. And I'm absolutely certain that a digital native can subvert anything that you can think of in software terms.
We're so outclassed in terms of that.
And so there aren't good answers. There's wishing and hoping. One of the things I wish and hope is that schools would stop making kids have devices which are highly addictive, because I've seen absolutely no evidence that there is any educational benefit in having those devices. So why on earth are we doing it? I feel schools have fallen hook, line and sinker for a marketing line from tech companies. The people who run these tech companies do not let their own kids use these devices. So why on earth are we forcing our kids to do it at enormous monetary cost to the schools, but much worse than that, enormous potential damage to the kids? What
about the argument, and it's one that I've made in the past because one of my kids' schools doesn't have devices and one kid does. What about the argument that this is the world? Like, we've got to equip them to live in the world, and, Latin or long division, those things are pretty irrelevant in this world. What about that argument?
When I went to school, they had computers in labs and classes cycled through those labs. Those computers were attached to the walls. They were not entertainment devices. They were teaching you how to use a computer. There's absolutely no reason not to continue to do that. There's absolutely no reason. I can't see any research that says there's a benefit of having the child have its own device, personal device, that they carry with them 24/7 versus allowing a child to access a computer that's attached to a wall in a school. There's no evidence of that. There's an enormous cost, just the cost in the infrastructure to parents and to schools, and an even bigger hidden cost, which is this potential for addiction. But I'm not saying don't let kids use computers, don't teach kids how to use computers. I'm saying do it in a way that doesn't also create a high potential for addiction.
Depression and anxiety, we are seeing an absolute, at the same time as things like teen pregnancy are coming down, teen anxiety and depression and suicide are going up. What's the connection that you've seen?
That's the paradox, so all these addictive behaviours that in the past, if you had asked anyone in 2007, what's the cause of teen anxiety, depression, suicide, etc., they would have said, it's all of these behaviours. It's alcohol, it's cigarettes, it's drugs, it's violence. All of these things are connected. Now, for the last 12 years, they've been going in the opposite direction. And in that same time frame, conservative estimates say teen anxiety has doubled and depression has at least doubled. Now, that tells you that the theory is wrong, or that something else is going on that has replaced that addictive behaviour. We know that addiction and anxiety are closely related, very closely related. From a biochemical perspective, becoming addicted looks almost exactly the same as anxiety and depression. And in fact, if you ask professionals on site alone, without taking a medical history, can you tell whether this person's is an addict or is suffering from anxiety and depression? And the answer is no, not from behaviour. You can if you take history, but not from behaviour. And so we know biochemically, and I go through the gory detail of this in the book, so I won't bore your listeners with it, but we know biochemically that it's a natural consequence from addiction. As addiction increases, so too does anxiety and depression. And teenagers have always been particularly susceptible to anxiety and depression because they're particularly susceptible to addiction. It's just that now we have a lot more things to be addicted to. And a lot more kids exposed to those things than would have been the case in the past. Yes, a few kids got access to marijuana in the 1960s, and a lot more got access to it in the 80s, and a lot more than that got access to it in the 90s, and now a lot less do. But that doesn't mean they're not addicted.
It's so true. You know, reading your book and you start thinking about this interruption of natural behaviours. So, you know, after school, you could run around the neighbourhood and play cops and robbers and have that excitement, or, you know, go on your go-kart and you could have that sort of danger. But you'd get physically tired and you'd have to stop, or it'd be dinner time and you'd have to go inside. You couldn't be at that peak danger excitement for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours in a row. Yeah. And similarly, you could socialise. You would socialise at school and you might, you know, be on the phone with a friend after school, but then you would come home and
there's a natural break
because your friend has to go and have dinner and you have to go and have dinner. Now the socialising of the playground goes on literally 24/7. Yep. And so girls particularly are more susceptible to it, never have that ability to just switch off from the social connections that they have.
Yep. That's right.
Right? Because there's an inbuilt fear that if I'm not part of it, well, then I'll miss out. I might not be part of the group, and then maybe they'll be talking about me.
Yeah, and that is in fact what would happen, because that's what the behaviour oxytocin drives, which is gluing the group together and making outsiders outsiders. And if you do something to make yourself an outsider, then that will emphasise that, exaggerate it, and drive it even harder. So the point of oxytocin is to make everybody in the group look, behave, and be the same. And as soon as you are different to that, i.e. by not participating in a chat that's occurring at 11 o'clock at night, that's a reason that perhaps you don't belong in the group. And then oxytocin can turn against you.
Where does the role of the performative nature of screen time and technology come into it? Because you write in the book about how Fortnite, it's not the same as when you put a video game on your computer and you were playing and no one could see you. Now with streaming and with Fortnite, it's live and people watch you and you're part of a group. And on social media, people are always watching you.
Yep.
How does that factor into the whole scrambled egg situation?
Remembering that I said that oxytocin doesn't just affect girls, it's just stronger in girls. It affects boys too, and that's the thing that gaming companies figured out pretty early on. It's actually a fairly recent innovation in gaming, which is probably in the last 4 to 5 years, to include the ability to talk to other people on your team, and have you be aware that they're there. Even when they're dead, they're still there. So when they're dead in the game, they're still there. They're watching, they're commenting, they're saying, oh, that was good, or that was terrible, or I would have done that. That's oxytocin working on boys. Or anyone else who plays games. It's just more likely to be boys.
We're generalising.
Yeah. But that's the same thing happening just as much as it would be on Instagram, which is that you're getting instant social feedback on your likability, your performance, etc.
Right.
It's one of the things that a lot of parents told me in the interviews I did for this book is, especially the parents of sons who are addicted to Fortnite, is one of the big reasons that the son will always give. You know, some parents have tried to implement a time limit, tried to say, all right, you can play this for an hour. It's never an hour. And one of the reasons, even if the parent tries to take it away at that point, they say, oh, well, I just need to finish this because I'll be letting my team down if I don't. So there is that built into the game, that notion of your team is depending upon you. You are critical to the performance of this thing. And if I don't just sign up for the next round, my team will be unable to compete and I'll be letting down 10 boys who can't play. So that team thing is being used by the game makers. It's a natural thing that happens in humans. So you'd get the same response from a member of a rowing crew, but they're using it to make you keep playing.
And it works well on parents too, because I've heard the argument, oh, if we don't let him play Fortnite, that's how he connects with all his friends after school, and then he won't be socially included. And if we don't let her have Instagram, everyone's on Instagram, so she has to be there. Otherwise, we're socially ostracizing her, like those kids that you grew up with who didn't have a television in their house growing up. And everyone will be talking about what happened on Prisoner last night or the Brady Bunch, and they didn't know, they couldn't be part of it, so they were relegated to outsider status. No one wants that for their kids.
No, that's right. You become that weirdo who doesn't understand what's going on Instagram.
So what's the answer, though?
The answer is...
No one wants their kids to be that weirdo.
And you don't, but the other downside is even worse, which is what you have to do, and I don't know that there are easy ways to do this, but what you have to do is keep talking to them about why it matters. I mean, kids think they're indestructible, but they're not stupid. Just as I found with sugar, whilst kids certainly love to binge on sugar, if you explain why it's not a good idea, eventually they listen. And I'm hoping the same applies here, which is you are going to have to ignore that. And I know that's going to be really hard, and maybe it's going to lose you some friends, but this is why. And maybe it'll work and maybe it won't. Fingers crossed.
Thank you for listening to No Filter. If you are still listening and you haven't thrown your phone in the bin, please don't do that, because it'll be very hard to listen to podcasts. If you want to hear more from David, search David Gillespie Knows How to Spot a Psychopath in your podcast app, or follow the link in our show notes to that show. I reckon it's one of the shows most people talk to me about when they bring up No Filter. They talk about pulling over on the side of the road when they were listening in their car and just going, oh my God, I've been in therapy for 20 years and now I finally understand my mother or my father or my ex-boyfriend or my former workmate or my boss. It's really like switching on a light in your brain, and it is just, I've found it so helpful in explaining a whole lot of things in my life, relationships with people that I just didn't understand. It's really a fantastic episode. Next week, we have Brooke Boney on the show, and she is talking to me about the way she's changing what we see on commercial TV. She's a proud Camilla Roy woman, and it was a really great chat. I'd heard a lot about Brooke, but I'd never met her before, so I think you'll really like what she's got to say. No Filter is produced by Eliza Ratliff. I am Mia Friedman, and I will see you on mamamia.com.au.